Friday class. Hopefully we'll be back next week. At least this week was always going to be very lecture heavy. And so it translates pretty well to just recording me talking over the slideshow, because I would have been talking a lot in class anyway. So you can just treat this the way we usually would in class and just take notes. And if you have any questions, you can email me, or I'll have office hours again next week if you want to Zoom instead. And then hopefully we'll see each other next Friday. Although there's bad weather supposed to come next week as well, so we shall see. I hope we're there next Friday, because we're doing the Vikings next week, and I've had to get rid of an awful lot of the activities I used to do in this class because of social distancing. But the nice thing about the Vikings is that I found a socially distant, neat thing to do. So I'll be pretty annoyed after having looked for it and put it together to not be able for us to meet in person to do it. So anyway, I think you'll be the least affected. I think if we're going to have snow, it'll be Monday's section that'll be worst affected. Okay, so the theme for this week was the re-spread of Christianity. The re-spread will become apparent as we move forward. So we're going to start with a focus on the so-called Germanic West. And that is where our focus for this course is mainly going to be on the West. So we're going to see about what happened there, the role of monks and monasticism in the conversion of previously pagan peoples, and I suppose the type of, I want to say the wrong type of Christian, because the church called them heretics, and how they converted them. Touch on popular religion, but really then we're going to move on to Byzantium, because we had to cut that short last time, and we're then going to discuss Islam, which is a bit awkward because it's kind of the build up to Spain, and obviously you did Spain last week and you were meant to do Islam last week and we ran out of time, and I thought, oh no, it'll be fine, we'll just do all religion together, but kind of means that the Spain story is out of chronology. So you can use your timeline to double check that, but I will be taking the timeline down temporarily this week, making it invisible, because you've got an exam coming up, and to stop you from just looking up answers. Okay, so let's look at very briefly the early history of Christianity. It gets to the point where Christianity starts off during the period of the Roman Empire as a subsect of Judaism. And it's pretty narrow in its approach and who is a Christian. But then it broadens hugely. To the point where by the time we hit the high Middle Ages, so certainly by the year 1000, all of Europe calls itself Christendom. What this means is that while medieval Europeans did not have a concept like we do today of a national identity, they would never have said, oh, I'm French, or I'm German, or Italian. They would have empathized with regional geographies far more. So they would have said, I am a, Lombard. I am from Languedoc. The one thing, so they've either got regional affiliations, or, unlike today, again, supranational in the form of Christendom. This is the thing that they believe connects the whole of Europe, is this adherence to Christianity. So we're going to look today really at how it got from a small subset of Judaism to Christendom. So it started as a Jewish sect, but it wasn't this for very long. It broadened out from being ethnically affiliated to a much broader community under the leadership of St. Paul. St. Paul defined Christianity as all who accepted Jesus. That's what it is to be a Christian in its essence. Now, the term has been used in modern times to mean different things and to have different synonyms. But what to be a Christian is to follow the teachings of Christ. And we can go back to St. Paul for that. By the year 400, Christianity was the official religion of the Roman state. We saw the other week how Emperor Constantine converted from to Christianity, although it was the Emperor Theodosius who made it the official religion of the Roman Empire. Part of the reason for its appeal was that it was what we call a monotheistic religion. That means that there's only one God. So it's like Judaism and Islam in that regard. Whereas if you were an adherent to the Roman religion, that was what we call a polytheistic religion, that there are many gods. Don't get there's usually one person gets Roman Catholicism confused with the Roman pantheon of gods. The connection is the city of Rome, as we're going to see shortly, so don't make that mistake. So 400, it's the official religion of the Roman Empire, and this means that by around this time, there's a lot of people are Christians. A lot of people have converted. It's well organized. There's a lot of people, and this means that they have already started building churches. They've already started distinguishing between the clergy who ministered and the laity, lay people who they served. And the clergy had to develop so that there was a hierarchy. At the bottom, the ordinary priests, who were supervised by bishops who, because it was the Roman Empire, governed a city and its region. The bishops were in turn supervised by archbishops, and atop this were the patriarchs. And the patriarchs were bishops of the 5 greatest cities of the Roman Empire. That is Rome, Alexandria in Egypt, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Constantinople. The Bishop of Rome, as you can see from this map, is the only one to reside in the West. All the other 4 are in the Eastern Roman Empire, which we know will become the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Bishop of Rome claimed preeminence over all Christians. His reason for doing this is the connection to St. Peter. St. Peter was held to have been the first bishop of Rome, and therefore the bishops of Rome could trace their lineage back to, the beginning of Christendom. They said their first pope was so tightly linked to the history of Christianity, this gave them an edge over the others who did not have this link. Now, no pope ever convinced the other 4 patriarchs that this was the case, but they certainly convinced the medieval West. What we see taking place over the whole course of the early Middle Ages, so from this time period right through to a final schism or split in 1054, is a widening between the religions of the East and the West. Last week we discussed how there were cultural and social widenings between East and West, with the East remaining a continuation of the Roman Empire and the West becoming so-called barbarian or Germanic West. And this split, as we'll see today, is witnessed in religion as well. Now, the split is to become so that it's the Catholic Church in the West and the Orthodox Church in the East. We might call it Roman Catholic in the West or Greek Orthodox in the East. But a way to think about it that we might see, 2 ways we might see in contemporary sources talking about the Middle Ages. They might call it Western Christian and Eastern Christian, in which case that is the distinction, that the West is Catholic and the East is Orthodox. But to reflect the cultural differences that we've already discussed, we often find the church in the West being called the Latin Church, and the church in the East, the Greek Church. So there are many ways to describe this. Already early on in the history of the church, there are splits. It begins as one form of Christianity, but there are many different splits even early on. There are lots of things called councils early in the church's history, and this is when all the head honchos get together and try and decide on a common policy. So from the get-go, we have different splits within Christianity, and obviously by the end of this semester, because it's a long way in the future yet, we'll get to the Protestant Reformation. But Protestants are still 1,000 years away. So up until we get to the end of the semester, we're going to be dealing with West and East, Christian versus Orthodox. Catholic versus Orthodox. Excuse me, stumbling. And of course, we'll finish off this class with the spread of Islam. Now, in class, I'd ask you if you had any ideas of the better way that we know the Patriarch of Rome, and most people already know that this is the Pope. That the Pope is the head of the Roman Catholic Church, so the head of the Latin Church. They're called Roman Catholic because they're centered on the city of Rome, as you've just seen. It's not any connection to the pantheon of pagan Roman gods. There's none of that at all. It's the Roman comes from being based in Rome. As I said, these popes in Rome argue that of the five, they're the ones that have the edge because they have the connection back to St. Peter. St. Peter being the first pope, Jesus himself having given Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven. They're like, well, this is a clear, bit of an edge over all the others. And Peter's successors were viewed as inheriting this. Now, Pope is the person. Papacy at the top of this slide means the office, so the position of Pope. So you might see Pope so-and-so in your textbook, or we talk about Pope so-and-so, but then we hear things called we might be talking about the papacy, in which case we're just talking about the office of Pope and all that's attached to it. Now, as I said, the early centuries of the Christian church was a time of many councils, which is when they get together to decide on basically church policy. So they had one in 381 called the Council of Constantinople, where they were sorting out this issue of who of the five had a bit of an edge. This council decreed that the Patriarch of Constantinople was the authority in the East, but ultimate authority went to the Pope in Rome. But not all Christians accepted this view. Part of the problem was that the Pope was in Italy. And once we get past, well, even before, but, once we're hitting the 5th century, as we know, Italy turns into a political hot mess. We talked last week about how Romulus Augustulus does not abdicate until 476. But it's become a rite of passage for every barbarian to sack Rome. So, even before the end of the Western Roman Empire, Italy was a hot mess. And this is where the Pope was based. It's not like he could up and leave. I mean, he was tied to Rome for a reason. So this meant that the Pope in Rome was always very politically vulnerable early in the history. Particularly, he was beholden to the Byzantine Emperor. Because remember, if we think back to our slide from last week, right at the end, when we talked about Justinian, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, he had conquered back a lot of the western parts of the Roman Empire, and that included a big chunk of Italy. So that included Rome, actually. And the Byzantines did manage to hold on to a lot of that part of southern Italy over the course of the early Middle Ages. So this meant that the political leader who controlled the territory around the Pope for much of the early Middle Ages was actually the Byzantine Emperor. So he needed to be nice to the Byzantine Emperor for that reason. But of course, there's also a Patriarch in Constantinople. So already there were issues there. Another thing early in the Pope's history is, while they sorted out that he was supposed to be the preeminent of the patriarchs, this policy is officially called Petrine supremacy, supremacy meaning supreme or number one, and the Petrine comes from St. Peter. So even though, the council has decided Petrine supremacy, there's not really any consensus as to how many powers the Pope should have and what exactly they should be. But that starts to change with a very capable and talented Pope. And this is Pope Gregory the Great. Pope Gregory is actually Gregory the First. We'll find several popes with the same name. That's a popular thing to do. So Pope Gregory the Great with Pope Gregory the First, and he was Pope from 590 to 604. Pope Gregory began as a monk, which is important considering his interests, and he had close connections to Byzantium. He had worked to protect Rome from the barbarian group called the Lombards, who threatened to occupy it. And he was really good at international relations, having connections with Byzantium, and he got on well with the Patriarch and the Emperor in Byzantium. And he had good relations with the other churches, Jerusalem and Alexandria and Antioch. But at the same time, he was quite prepared to stand his ground with regards to Petrine supremacy. But that is not why we remember him. We remember him because of his success at converting pagans to Christianity. Not only the pagans, but he was very talented at getting other types of Christians to convert to Catholicism. For example, a type of Christianity that was gaining popularity in Western Europe among the barbarian tribes in the early Middle Ages was a type of Christianity called Arianism. So Arianism is another type of Christianity that Catholic and Orthodox is. It's not really around today because they called it a heresy back then. The heretic being the person, but a heresy is anyone, sorry, the heretic is the person, but heresy is the belief in teachings that are not the official line of the church. So this could be pretty easy to spot, or it could be pretty nuanced. Arians were declared heretics pretty early on in the church's history, one of these councils, when they were deciding the nature of the Trinity. Arianists who were following the teachings of a guy called Arius, it's not that they were Aries star sign, they were following Arius, they believed that they had difficulty with the concept that Jesus was both man and divine. They were like, nope, that does not go. But obviously, that's a pretty basic tenet of Christianity today. But that is why they were declared heretics. So quite a few of the barbarians had converted to this type of Christianity. And obviously, it's about as good to Pope Gregory the Great and as being pagan. So it was converting Arians to Catholics and pagans to Catholics too. So he was really, really talented at this. One of the means that he did it was, well, the main means he did it was missionaries. And a lot of these were monks. He drew on his own background. For example, one of the things that survives is a letter that he wrote to a guy called St. Augustine of Canterbury. And in this letter, he sets out his policy for conversion, which is very compromising. Let's compromise. Let's meet in the middle. There's certain things that he's like, yeah, we can bend on this, and certain things he's like, no, we cannot bend on this. For example, one thing they couldn't bend on was, there's only one God. It's a monotheistic religion, not a polytheistic religion, and the people had to drop their whole pantheon of gods. And pantheon is a technical term for like a household of gods, like the accepted plurality of gods. And we can see this with the Vikings, and more recent research has indicated that the Vikings really struggled with dropping the pantheon of their gods. They really liked the idea of Jesus when they were taught about him and thought he was a great guy. But when they were told, okay, great, so you'll convert to Christianity, they're like, yeah, great, we really like this Jesus guy. Let's make him, I don't know, Thor's brother or something. He'll fit in really well in the pantheon. They were like, no, you get one God. And Vikings were like, one God? No. We'll accept your God and we'll include him. But one God when we could have many? That's, no. So that seems to have been a particular problem. But as I said, we've got primary sources. Remember that sources written at the time. So letters from Pope Gregory himself. So we can see exactly what policies he pursued, which was, there are certain things we can do to make them more willing to convert. And remember, they have to appeal to a warrior society as well. And he was very, very successful with his missionary activity. Now, if we were in class, I'd ask you the Franks. Who are the Franks? Because last week, in the video, the Nearpod, I mentioned the Franks, and I was talking about all the different types of barbarian groups. One of the ones I touched on briefly were the Franks, and I didn't tell you very much about them. I just said I'm mentioning them because they're going to be really important next week. And here they are back again. They are important this week. Now, you might remember that one of the key names was Clovis. Monday class, remember Clovis? And I always think that Clovis, well, actually, the Franks overall just don't really have very intimidating sounding names, even though they actually are really scary dudes. Clovis always sounds like a butter brand or dairy brand or something, but actually he was a tough guy. He was the one, to think back to last week, expanded the Frankish territory, expanded and created a capital of Paris. It's still the capital of France. Clovis converted to Catholic Christianity, and he forced everybody else to, because, you know, that's how you converted people. And part was get the king to convert, and then he makes everybody else convert. And this was a really clever move on Clovis's part, because number one, he was in France mainly, and there's actually still people of Roman descent in France. We're not that long after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. There's people who consider themselves ethnically Roman, and they were Christian under the Roman Empire and remained Christian, if less contact with the Pope. So this kind of gave him a lot of legitimacy as a rightful king in the eyes of the Roman descendants in France. Gave him legitimacy. Also gave him excuses to attack lots of people who were not Christian, or not the right kind of Christian too. For example, the Visigoths had converted to Arianism, but obviously Arianism is a heresy, so he's like, oh, well, you know, gonna have to invade them, gonna have to take their territory, and they'll either have to convert to Christianity or be put to the sword. So Clovis, despite sounding like a dairy brand, was a scary dude. Also, he managed to unite a huge part of Europe under his kingship. And as we know from last week, this is not something that kings was not a position that the barbarians naturally had. Yes, they had an aristocracy who ruled, but not really one person. So you had to be a really, really tough individual to force yourself to become kings over all the others. And indeed, after Clovis's death, his sons divided his realm. And this was far more usual, to have lots of people ruling. And you know, even then, that was based on military might. Now, a special relationship started to evolve between the Pope and the Franks, or as they're going to become known, the Carolingians. If we move on a couple of generations, we had a guy called Charles Martel. He's also called Charles the Hammer. Now, Charles Martel was mentioned in the video on Spain last week. He was the one who defeated the Muslim forces coming up from Spain at the Battle of Tours-Poitiers. Because of this, which effectively halted the expansion of Islam northwards out of Spain, kept them in Spain, he was given the special title by the Pope, Protector of the Faith. This gave him, you know, he's feeling pretty good about this title. Martel's son, Pepin, or Pippin, who again does not sound scary but is. I think Pippin actually sounds more like a hobbit than a killer king, but you know. Pepin assumed the Frankish kingship, and he got approval for this from the Pope at the time, who was Zacharias I. And indeed, Zacharias sent a representative to be there to crown Pepin as king. A few years later, the Pope himself went to Francia to see Pepin and reinforce the crowning. And we might think, why did the popes do this? And if we were in class, we'd really think about things that the Carolingians had to gain from this relationship with the Pope, and things that the Pope had to gain from allying with the Carolingians. And the Pope has a lot to gain. He needed to cement his position in Italy. He also needed military aid. In particular, the Lombards are back. And the Pope was worried about what's going to happen to Rome if the Lombards take over, because the Lombards have not converted to Christianity. Pepin, because he's buddies with the Pope, goes to Italy with his warriors and defeats the Lombards. So the Pope's like, good work, Pepin. I like you very much. You've protected me. And more importantly, the land surrounding Rome was formally recognized by Pepin as a territory governed by the Pope following his defeat of the Lombards. And this was called the Donation of Pepin. I'd ask you in class, where does the Pope rule today? And you'd say the Vatican City, which is a tiny, tiny area in the modern city of Rome. But back in the Middle Ages, the Pope was ruler of a very big territory called the Papal States, and this is where it began. This means that the Pope in the Middle Ages, a lot of people initially get confused as to why the Pope has so much power. But the Pope isn't just a major religious leader, he's also a major political leader in the Middle Ages. Not only is he the head of Christendom, which ties all Europeans together, he's also the ruler of vast territories in Italy and elsewhere. So he's actually a political leader in his own right as well as a religious leader. The other thing the Pope has got to gain from all of this is he can break away from the Byzantines. He's been pretty dependent on them, but the relationship has become very strained. In part, this is because the Byzantines are really into a thing called iconoclasm. And this is icons. They love icons, artworks, pictures of religious things. The Pope does not agree with their reliance on icons. He thinks it's got too close to idolatry. Also, the Byzantines are becoming weaker. The era of Justinian is long over. So he sees the Byzantines as never been the best ally for him and certainly becoming a worse ally. So the Pope decides to harness himself to the future of the Carolingians, which was a good call for him for history. Now, Pepin dies in 768 AD, and his son is the most famous of the Carolingians, Charlemagne. He's the most famous Carolingian king. Charlemagne means Charles the Great. He was very religious. We call this being pious. And he was also a warrior king. He took to battle every year. He expanded the territory of the Carolingians even further. In fact, the territory under Charlemagne's control was France and Germany and Netherlands and Belgium. It's such a huge empire. It is not going to be as big an empire in Europe until Napoleon. That's how big it is. His power led to him being recognized as special title Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III. Now, at this point, I would say this title is fake news. And I'd ask you, why is it fake news? And you'd think about it and say, well, there is Rome, it's in the east, but there's no Rome in the west. And yes, it's right. And I tell you that this crowning, which is the picture on the right here, took place on Christmas Day 800. You go, well, there's been no Western Rome for like over 300 years, so what? Also, Charlemagne's from the Franks, he's from the barbarians, he's not a Roman. And go, yes, so hence fake news. In fact, the territory is going to break up, and one part of it is France, another part of it is going to be the Holy Roman Empire. They keep the title, and it's not holy, it's not Roman, it's not an empire either. It's very much fake news. But it's fake news, it's propaganda that works pretty well, because Charlemagne has ambitions, Pope has ambitions, and now he's got a title, Emperor of the Romans, and that says he's got a status equal to Byzantium, which is still Rome. So, not great for international relations, but good for relations with the Pope. The Pope is the one who has the ability to bestow such power. So it gives the Pope power, because he's got the ability to bestow power. So if he can give it, he can also take it away. And this cements a relationship between the West and the Pope and Rome. Before this relationship was cemented, the Pope had to rely on the Byzantine Emperor. But by creating their own Western rival, they hoped to escape the Byzantine influence. And indeed, Charlemagne did a lot for the church, converted a lot of people to Christianity, and he also did a lot of church reform in the Carolingian Empire, becoming the greatest Christian ruler of his time. The popes, in turn, grew closer and closer and severed their ties to the east. But as I said, this title, Christmas Day 800, is really a name only. It's not really a revival of the Roman world. They just like to think so, and it makes themselves look good by showing off a connection to Rome and its emperors. It also implies that the Byzantines don't exist, which does not go down well with the Byzantines. Even worse, it's not an emperor at that time, it's an empress, the Empress Irene. So this does not do well for international relations because it implies that they don't count and that their throne is empty. So they're not happy. But the Pope said, well, you're a woman, so it's only temporary. Charlemagne had already officially recognized her, though. So to make up for, this massive offense that he had caused, he offered to marry her. Did not go down well with Irene at all, or the Byzantines at all. Very distasteful. Ultimately, eventually, Irene went into a monastery, became a nun. So this did a lot for good for the Pope. He set up the West against the East. The West did a lot for. They received their authority from the Pope. It secured a long-term commitment to church reform. Charlemagne's religious activity is very well recorded because he had a biographer, a guy called Einhard. And there's an extract from this in your textbook, which you should read. Don't be like Einhard, though. Students should not be like Einhard. Einhard was a plagiarist. Einhard copied Suetonius' Life of Augustus and just basically changed the name Augustus to Charlemagne. Well, this does at least show the continuing cultural influence of Roman Europe, which was part of what we call the Carolingian Renaissance, which is on the next slide. The thing that students enjoy the most about Einhard's biography of Charlemagne is that Einhard writes about Charlemagne's good behaviour, how pious he is, what a good man. He's so, tough on himself. He's a role model for us all. He only drinks 3 goblets of wine every day. That's probably around 1.5 litres of wine every day. The moral of the story, don't play beer pong with a Carolingian. Definitely not wine pong. Charlemagne is also going to be important for us in a few weeks when we're going to look back at him and you're going to hate him because you're going to have to remember awkward words that came about because of him. Charlemagne needed help to govern this enormous territory that he had expanded by military conquest. He was pretty brutal as well as being religious and artistic. The social structures that he implemented to help control this massive empire are very important for later medieval society. He created special lords to protect the empire, and this starts the medieval social system, we're going to call the bad F word, feudalism. So feudalism gets started under Charlemagne and is cemented following him. And we're going to be looking at that in a few weeks. When Charlemagne died, his sons were not as strong and his empire started to split up. The western Frankish lands went to his son Charles the Bald. Louis the German got the eastern lands, and Lothar got the title of emperor in the Middle Kingdom. Basically, France and Germany would spend the rest of the time fighting over the Middle Kingdom. And eventually, 2 very different cultures emerged, separated by language. That is, France and Germany. But during this time period too, the aristocracy got to be very powerful at the expense of centralised kingship. Hence the rise of feudalism, and that's a characteristic of medieval society that we're going to come back to. Now, as I said, Charlemagne, this was also a very culturally vibrant time, called the Carolingian Renaissance. You might have thought there was only one Renaissance, but Renaissance means rebirth. So there are actually many Renaissances, and this is one of them. In this Renaissance, we have monks busily tracking down Roman and Greek works and copying them. The place where they did this was in their monasteries in this special room called a scriptorium. It's plural, is scriptoria. That's what's shown in the picture on the right here. So these monasteries and these monks were, the intellectuals of early medieval Europe. So the monks copied the classical works. They kept knowledge alive, hence the term Carolingian Renaissance. It's also not the Dark Ages after all. This is the time period that people often call, it's the Dark Ages. But it can't be because they preserved lots and lots of knowledge. Still very light. That's definitely fake news. The other reason why there's Carolingian Renaissance is Charlemagne needed lots of people to help him run his big empire, and we call that the bureaucracy, the government who does the government running of the area. So they needed to be literate. So this whole period is an uptake in literacy, in creating books, but nothing original, nothing terribly new. It was returning to Roman works, just like Einhard, think about Einhard, copying Suetonius. That was what characterizes the Carolingian Renaissance. Now, let's turn back to the East, since we've just seen how they were massively insulted by the West. Here's those icons that I mentioned before that really offend well, actually a lot of Byzantines as well. It divided Byzantium into people who liked the icons and those who didn't, and as well as between East and West. So the church over time became divided between its various patriarchs, and there were lots more divisions that appeared over the early Middle Ages. For example, in Byzantium, the emperor, which we looked at last class, he had very close relations with the patriarch. In fact, it was the emperor who appointed the patriarch. So that kind of explains why the emperor is not particularly interested in the Pope. He didn't appoint the Pope. The Pope just had to be nice to him. And the emperor was also considered Christ's representative on earth, because remember, he's descended from the Roman Empire. So a big divide between East and West was the use of these icons. And as you can see, they're holy statues and pictures. These had come to assume a very important role in Byzantine religious worship. This was open to interpretation as idolatry. Those who were ignorant could confuse veneration and a way of feeling connected to God as worshipping the actual pictures rather than using them as an intermediary. So there was a big split over this within Byzantium, but also between East and West. The Pope thought that they had really taken this too far. Iconoclasm lost influence in the 9th century eventually and was condemned. But, this is one of many splits. Another one being Latin versus Greek. The West was still clinging on to, or rather rediscovering, the Latinists, whereas, as we talked about last week, with the move to Constantinople, it was increasingly a Greek cultural world. So this divide between East and West had really gone very far by the time it becomes official. It doesn't become official until the Great Schism of 1054. And in 1054, the Pope, being the leader of Western Christianity, and the Patriarch in Constantinople, being the leader of Eastern Christianity, formally excommunicated each other. And I know that you know what excommunication means from your Nearpod that you did earlier this week. So this marks a schism, and schism is a fancy word for split. So it means that there is an official split between the Catholic Christian Pope in Rome and the Eastern Orthodox Christian Patriarch Constantinople. And to this day, the two were never ever reunified. They're still completely two different branches of Christianity. Now, as you can see here, these are rather attractive looking icons. There's lots of gold and lovely bright colours here. And in fact, Byzantium is famous for its art and architecture. If you're ever away on vacation, or even if you're up in St. Louis and there's the possibility of going to an exhibition in a museum of Byzantine art, I definitely recommend it, because you're just going to be like so dazzled by all the bling. It's like, rap stars could not dream of the bling that the Byzantines did. And we can see it in the architecture as well. So the exterior could be really quite plain, unlike in the West at the same time. So the outside decoration of their churches tended to be, patterned brick or frescoes, tasteful, like the one on the right here. You see, it's very pretty looking. It's got lovely arches, but the picture in the middle of all the gold with the giant Christ, that's the inside of this same church. It's in Monreale in Sicily. So the inside is very beautiful, while the outside is quite plain. And you can see that's a lot of gold. That is a lot of bling. That's a blinding amount of bling in that cathedral. So that was a general trend in Byzantine churches. Carvings are also very popular. Again, this is the same church at the bottom right here. Those are carved cloisters. It's hard to see on this picture, but they're very intricately carved. So they like mosaics, they like frescoes, they like carvings on the inside. If we look at that picture on the top left, I'd say, what does this look like? And usually it's like, it looks more like a mosque than a Byzantine church. And say, yes, it actually is a mosque nowadays. But that is the famous Hagia Sophia that we mentioned last week, connected with the Emperor Justinian, who had it built. It is a mosque today. It started off as an Orthodox church, but obviously 1453, the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople and they converted the Hagia Sophia church into a mosque because they were Muslim. All right, so on that note, let's actually turn to Islam. Oh, here's Justinian. I remember I put this in now just as a reminder in case you needed to remember when he ruled or wanted the reference point of this map about like how he expanded the Roman territory. So I'm just going to give you a second to look at that and refresh your memory, and then we'll move on to Islam. All right. So Islam is a medieval religion. Now, technically, of course, Christianity is a Roman religion since it came about during the Roman Empire, but we've just seen it really, this week, really became a world religion and powerful religion in the Middle Ages. But Islam is wholly a medieval religion. It is associated with the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad was born around the year 571 in Mecca. Mecca was a trading city in Arabia. So it is down on the bottom right-hand side of this map. Now, Mecca was a very cosmopolitan trading city with lots of people from different cultural backgrounds, lots of different religions. And this means that Muhammad, by the time he was an adult man, had encountered lots of different religions. When he was an adult, he started to have visions. In these visions, the angel Gabriel recited the words of a single almighty God. And this is a monotheistic religion, one God, but in Arabic, God is Allah. Now, these visions that Muhammad had completed earlier recitations by prophets such as Moses and Jesus. So Muhammad was the most recent in a long line of religious reform. So Islam has its origins in Christianity and Judaism too. They share a common heritage. Islam means surrender, and that's the ethos of the whole religion, that you surrender to the will of God. Muhammad had the visions and had ideas about fusing religion and politics, which were opposed in Mecca, so he moved to a place called Medina. It's also marked on this map. Here he achieved a fusion, I don't have any more status visions, fusion of religion and politics that was central to the medieval faith. Muhammad won the citizens of Medina over to Islam and became the leader of Medina, which is logical because he had religious teachings as well as political as well. And obviously, as we've learned, this is fairly common in the Middle Ages too. Medina made war on Mecca. That's what the cross here means on this map. They're actually two little swords crossing. So Medina made war on Mecca and incorporated it in many other areas in Arabia. So by the time of Muhammad's death in 632, Arabs were united by religion, they were well armed, and they were organized. It's absolutely remarkable how much Muhammad achieved in his lifetime, because he dies in 632, but he's only had his visions when he was an adult. So he accomplished so much in a very short space of time. Now, Muhammad's political successors were called the caliphs. And again, they were both religious and political leaders. So they were deputies of Muhammad. That also meant deputies of God. And they led armies. Now, early in the history of the faith, they came from the ranks closest to Muhammad, because it was around the time that he lived. Now, Islam began to conquer weaker areas around the Mediterranean, which is going to be my next picture. But I want you to pause a minute and take another look at this map. This map is spread of Islam to 1624 AD. So we're before even the death of Muhammad, which is going to be on the next slide. Green is the area under Islam. Look at how much is purple with the Byzantines, okay? And see where that is. And then we're going to move to the next picture. So Islam began to conquer weaker areas around the Mediterranean. I know this picture is hard to see. It's a very good map, even though it's hard to see. So the expansion under Muhammad went from that little green dot to the stripy areas on this map, which is a massive chunk of Arabia. Under the first caliphs, those are the direct successors for Muhammad, drawn from the ranks closest to him. They're the dark grey bits, okay? And then the next one under the Umayyads, the dynasty that'll come next, I'll explain shortly, is the darker grey. That goes up to about the year 750. And as you'll know from your video last week on Spain, 750 is roughly the end of the expansion of the Islamic world. It becomes stable after that point, stops expanding. So what we're looking at on this map here is the extent of the Islamic world in the early Middle Ages. It's remarkable how much they conquered. And I'd now ask you, where have they conquered? Like, who had this land before? And it's mainly the Byzantines and the Sassanids. But, you know, the Mediterranean, that was Byzantine territory. And this actually explains why they were so successful. As we talked about in the video last week on Spain, early Islam was very, very tolerant, particularly compared to other medieval religions. They believed that the brothers of the book should be able to, they have a common heritage, and this gave them a special status, and they could practice their religion. They didn't have to convert to Islam at this point. There were, you know, issues later on, but not at this point. So a lot of people welcomed the expansion of Islam, particularly around Syria, Palestine area, because they had been under the Byzantines. I didn't like the Byzantines. You know, Byzantines were a pain in their backside. They had to pay a huge amount of taxes. They never saw any benefit of it. Oh, look, here is a bunch of people who you know, will grant us religious toleration, and they've got really good trade networks, and we can make lots of money. They were happy bunnies. They were pretty happy. So they conquered areas around the Mediterranean, including big parts of the Byzantine Empire, and that's going to be important when we get to the Crusades. And then from the 600s, they expanded into Western Europe, Iberia, we talked about last week. The armies were very strong. They faced very little opposition because all these areas had not very much loyalty to the previous regimes, or in the case of North Africa and Spain, you know, not very powerful leaders. So an intentional side product was that they founded cities where they went. The Islamic world was much more urban than the Western world. So this also helped them provide unity. So Islam was not just a new faith to the Mediterranean, but a new culture too. If we go forward to 655, we have an issue with the end of these caliphs, the first, the leaders who came from the ranks closest to Muhammad, because we're getting further away from the time that Muhammad lived. So a dynastic war broke out between the Umayyads, who were a leading family from Mecca, and Ali, who was the son-in-law of Muhammad. Muhammad only had daughters, he didn't have sons. Ali's followers insisted that the leader of Islam should be a direct descendant of the Prophet. In 661, though, Ali had lost support and he was assassinated, which allowed the formation of the Umayyad dynasty until 750. Dynasty, remember, we talked about it before, it's a group of rulers who are all kind of connected to one another, same family, roughly. The Umayyads, were based at Damascus, which is in Syria, so you need to look to the right-hand side of this map for Damascus. Ali's followers, though, evolved into Shi'ism, and they placed importance on the caliphs as coming from the descendants of Muhammad. But the Sunnis, like the Umayyads, based their beliefs on the Quran, which was is the name for the Islamic holy book, and the practices of the Prophet, who behaved most like a prophet. And this is where we get the split between Shiite and Sunni Muslims, which is still the main split in Islam to this day. In the 10th century, the Shiites gained control of Egypt, and they established their own dynasty called the Fatimid dynasty, based in Cairo. The Muslim expansion into Western Europe, as we know, was halted in defeat, in battle, in the Battle of Tours-Poitiers in the south of modern France by the Frankish leader Charles Martel. And this means that by 750, the period of Muslim expansion was over. This did, though, mean, as we know from last week, a period of cultural exchange. It's remarkably, comparatively, pretty peaceful time in the Mediterranean. It's a time of more religious tolerance because of the brothers of the book. Moses and Jesus were both prophets in Islam. And early Islam saw itself as reforming the more corrupt practices in a long common tradition. So you think back to last week when we learned about Spain and the coexistence in Spain. Another point to stress here, as I wrap up, is that religion is not unchanging. You know, we're going to come back to religion when we talk about the Crusades. We're going to see a lot of roots of what happens with the Crusades back in what we're describing today. But it's also important to stress religion is not static, does not go unchanged. what we have today in our religions is not the same as what medieval people had as our religions, even though they've got the same titles. So this is the end of what you would have received in class. I hopefully next week, next Friday, we'll get to learn about the Vikings. And that will, when we learn about the Vikings and we finish next Friday, that will be the end of our block on the early Middle Ages. You'll then have the exam to do, and I've changed the deadline on that because it suddenly occurred to me that it wasn't very fair of you guys to have only Friday evening to take the exam. So you've got until Sunday to take it. And the exam covers everything up to and including the Vikings. It's kind of like the ancient world / early medieval block. The reason why we're doing the Vikings is they're a nice segue into the High Middle Ages, which is the time period that comes next, but also they're the last of the so-called Germanic, so-called barbarian groups, and they're one of the last to convert to Christianity too. So that is why they come right at the end. So guys, I hopefully see you next Friday. In the meantime, please stay safe, look after yourselves, and yeah, I'll hopefully see you next week.